Let's get going. So hi everybody, and welcome back to our latest Lunch and Learn all about the Remediation Bill. And really the question we're trying to sort of answer today, or throw some more light on, is whether this is going to be a game changer for remediation of unsafe buildings, or whether it's just effectively more of what we currently have. Is it really going to move the dial? So to join me in that discussion, I've brought back Ben Bushell, who some of you might recognise from back in February when we were talking about building safety managers. So welcome back, Ben. Thank you for giving up your time again to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Matt and team. It's always a pleasure to discuss these points. They are incredibly important to our working environment and our living environment. So once again,
Brilliant.
Thanks.
That's great. And since we last saw you, I think you've had a promotion or an elevation of status, which I think is even more relevant to what we're talking about today. So can you run us through what happened with the Institute of Clerk of Works?
Yeah, I've been a member of the Institute of Clerk of Works and Construction Inspectorate for quite a while now, and always inspired to work closely with the team there and the other members. A fantastic organisation of construction quality professionals, and I had the privilege of being ordained, I suppose, it may be a strong term, but asked to join the board of directors for the institute, which puts me in a fantastic and privileged position to represent all qualified clerk of works within the institute on matters such as these. So I will, during today's conversation, I will speak both as a director of a commercial asset in Fortis Charter, which deals with building safety, etc., but also, and probably more prominently, the role of a clerk of works, the issues that we face, how we deal with those issues, and sort of the associated parameters that they set within a remediation construction phase.
Yeah, so you really are at the sharp end of seeing a lot of buildings that have got problems and are various stages through remediation, whereas I tend to look at them through the lens of people send me photos and we see things in safety case reports, but very rarely get out onto site anymore. So you've got that direct experience of watching walls being opened up and seeing what lurks beneath, right?
It's a lot of what we do these days. We've dealt with many projects like this. At any one time, we have 10 to 20 of these projects with various client bases. My staff commercially are on these risks every week. I personally try and get onto at least one of these risks every week. So hopefully today I'll be able to shed some light on some real-time issues and things that arise, and create a bit of a narrative around what we should consider moving forwards in relation to this bill. Perfect.
And hopefully you'll explain a bit more as we go through about what for those that don't know, what a clerk of works does and what a typical inspection visit might look like. And
I'll answer any questions asked, and I will try and build some context around the position that we hold in a project.
Perfect. Thank you. And just to remind everybody of what we do, and I sort of using the royal we here, because you're involved in this through a partnership that we have with Fortis and Charter. But what we do for a day job, because sometimes I sort of assume that people know exactly what we do. So I thought it's probably better just to explain in very high level terms again what we do as an organisation, what we do together. So really, this falls down into a number of stores. So one is we work with clients to compile and manage their golden thread, and we do that through ways of working and through software provision, which we call the Track My Risks platform. So this is a key requirement, I would say, of good practice anyway, but also a legal requirement under the Building Safety Act for buildings that fall into the scope of that. We also work through the development of Safety Case, which again is a Building Safety Act requirement, and the software that powers that and produces Safety Case reports.
Yeah.
And then over the top of that is a layer of managed services. So this is pretty much everything that you might need to do to join those two parts together for the regulator, but also who you might want to bring into the team. So in terms of referrals to structural engineers and fire engineers, etc., making that happen. So ultimately, when you do all of this well, you get to a point where we would say you are regulator ready. So again, this is thousands of buildings all moving towards regulator readiness. It would be great if they all were regulator ready, but they're not. So in a high level, that's kind of what we do together and individually. Again, I think we could probably take questions at the end about that, which so everybody's got the context of kind of what we do when we're not presenting lunch and learn webinars, etc.
Absolutely, and please do ask, because
yeah,
it would be very interested to speak to you about it.
Perfect. And a good part of that, I think we both agree with is sharing knowledge about what's going on, because a lot of this stuff is new, including the remediation bill that we're talking about today, and keeping plugged into the network of the industry to piece together what various people are learning and sharing that knowledge, so hopefully we can all make people safer, I think is the
fundamentally that's it, Matt. You know, the focus is resident safety. The buildings get covered as by default on that basis, but ultimately we want to create a better, safer, well-managed built environment for everybody.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. So turning to the remediation bill, let's talk about the problem first. So I think a lot of people mention remediation, we talk about the building safety crisis and all that sort of stuff, but actually, how big is it? I think we all know this is a big issue. The question of how big, the only real arbiter of this from a data perspective is the government. And let me just run through how they manage this. So every month, the government issue a monthly data release about building safety remediation. So the last one was on the 24th of June. So they're the numbers that we're pulling today for the purposes of this. There are some drawbacks to it, which I'll run through, but ultimately, in terms of the high-level latest stats, there are between 3,500 and 5,000 blocks left to remediate. So these are buildings that have either been identified as having building safety problems and the work hasn't started, or they are buildings where the government believes there are building safety problems, but those buildings have not yet been identified to them. So again, 3,500 to 5,000 blocks, roughly. There are 2,080 that they already know about. So they know the names and addresses, they know who the responsible persons are or the accountable persons, but these, for whatever reason, have not started their remediation yet, but they have been identified, they're being tracked. And there are between 1,500 and 3,000 blocks which the government have identified or believe there is a problem with, but they haven't been formally moved into formal sort of tracking and reporting. So throwing a few more numbers at you without sort of overloading the slides, as at today's date, my interpretation is there are 1,672 blocks that have been remediated. There are 659 nationally that are in remediation at the moment. So work is progressing on site. So there's only 659 active remediation projects, and 2,080 that have not been started, but the government are aware of, which gives you 4,411 blocks, which is what tallies with the monthly data release in terms of the numbers. The big flaw with all of this in terms of the data release is there is no data published whatsoever for low-rise buildings. This is purely 11 meter plus, so mid-rise and high-rise blocks. Absolutely nothing low. I mean, Ben, what are your thoughts on the stats? I mean, what's your take on what I've just talked through?
My first instinct is, if you compare what's been done to what is left to do, you know, I know the level of input that these projects require. I know the planning and the design work and the funding, all these things that link into them. And it just seems like to continue doing it the way that we're doing it, which is fairly uniform, if I'm honest with you, there's a lot of work there. There's a lot to do, and I have some personal doubts over the feasibility of the date set in the bill, which we'll come to later, I'm sure. And but it will take a collaborative approach. And as you've just quite rightly pointed out, it's limited to buildings in the first instance, 18 meters plus, then 11 meters, but doesn't take into account sort of low-rise developments yet. And that the there is an argument there that they still present significant risk, and it's probably not one for today. But so I think, Mike, to summarise, I very much look forward to hearing conversation around how this can be done, how we can maintain our high standards of QA and third-party accountability on projects like this in such a short proposed time frame.
Perfect, thank you. So going forward, the remediation bill. I've put 2026 on it. This is the anticipate, and we'll go into what the potential risks are to this. But at the moment, the expectation is that this will go through Parliament this imminently. The Property Institute. So this is the organisation, that professional body for property managers. That headline urges the government to strengthen remediation bill as progress stalls. This is a recent headline, which I'll come back to in a minute. The government response was in the King's speech on the 13th of May, which, just in case anybody doesn't know who the King is, we put a picture of him there. But King Charles said in his speech that my government will bring forward a bill to speed up remediation for people living in homes with unsafe cladding. So this is the remediation bill. So effectively, the government have said this bill will be brought forward in this session of Parliament. That was in the King's speech. Potentially, just to throw one major risk to this into the mix, with the announcement from Sir Keir Starmer that he's standing down as Prime Minister, and all that entails, it has, as I understand it from political people that I've spoken to, increased the risk of an early general election from whoever takes over. Assuming it's Andy Burnham, he may well go for a general election sooner than waiting for the next few years until 2029. If he does that, Parliament would need to be prorogued. This session of Parliament would end, and therefore pretty much every bill that's in the King's speech would fall. And that may or may not come back when the new Parliament sits post the general election. So that's one risk to it. Another risk to it is that, which I think would be unusual, is that the new Prime Minister decides that actually this isn't a priority, and he'll ignore what was in the King's speech, or basically slow pedal the progression of this bill. So there are some risks to this. This is by no means a certainty that the remediation bill is even going to happen, but we will see. Don't have a crystal ball. I think in anticipation of that, there is a thing which is causing a lot of confusion, and many of you might have seen this. I've had to reply to a few LinkedIn posts about it, but in June this popped up. So add leaseholder to remediation bill, put it into the House of Lords as a private member's bill by Baroness Pinnock, and we have a huge amount of confusion. There are a lot of lawyers, etc., writing about this and posting on LinkedIn effectively as though this is on its way and this is going to happen. Again, my soundings from everybody that knows far more about legal process than me is that for a private member's bill to become law is exceptionally rare, and for a Lords initiated private member's bill to become law is even rarer than that. This does seem to duplicate quite a bit. It does enhance, I think, what the government proposing in the remediation bill, but it has a couple of issues. It introduces some new language, which may or may not be adopted, but that's around large residential buildings. So we've got HRBs, higher risk buildings. There is now a concept of a large residential building that's introduced in this bill, which effectively is everything over 11 metres. It introduces a concept of licensing developers to develop large residential buildings, so they would need to be licensed. It introduces a concept of systemic defects, which is much broader than what we talk about at the moment, building safety defects. And the onus is on the building owner or the responsible person to demonstrate to leaseholders that the defect is not systemic. If it's systemic, then leaseholders are protected from having to pay to put it right or remediate it. And the other thing that jumped out at me that was positive, I thought, was around the rights of leaseholders to see information about their building. So a 28-day duty of disclosure of information of survey reports and risk assessments, etc., which some of that sort of exists at the moment for buildings in the scope of the Building Safety Act, so over 18 metres, under the keeping and provision of information regs, but this sort of builds this up. But the key problem with this bill, as I see it, is there is a development block within this bill. So effectively, to paraphrase, if a developer has any unremediated buildings in its portfolio, it will be blocked from completing existing new developments and achieving planning permission of future developments until such time as all of their buildings are remediated. So that would probably, at the moment, I could imagine that virtually all of the major house builders in this country will have at least one project, for whatever reason, even if it's not their fault, that is stuck in the, or has not completed remediation. We've already talked about 3,500 to 5,000 buildings still being in the pipeline. Effectively, that I think would stop pretty much all house building overnight if that were to become law. So I think for all those things considered, I mean, Ben, what are your thoughts? I mean, when I told you about that,
look, there's a lot, as you quite rightly pointed out, there's a lot of new language, there's a lot of new sort of perspective being generated by this bill, and naturally it's important to understand the parameters of those things. The issue of block development is obviously significant, not only for the developers, but for the built environment in general. I am one of the, I shout the loudest out of a lot of people, alongside yourself and others, about the safety of residents, and it's imperative that we do that. But I feel I do have a level of nervousness around that wording, and in terms of what it would look like, because people still need places to live and things like that. However, hopefully what it does do is demonstrate the importance of embracing the need to remediate, the ability, it'll set a standard where people prioritize safety of the residents that are already in the buildings that have been built. So I need to learn more. I understand how important it is, but I need to learn more about what that looks like. And I think what's equally as important is that these deadlines that have been set within the bill to date are attainable. And I do have some issues around that, which we'll get to later on in this presentation.
And I think for me, the hope with this is it's raising awareness. Hopefully it will put some pressure on the government to act, and maybe some of the good bits from this will get incorporated through amendments into the remediation bill. We will see. And I'll talk in a minute about how that's progressing. As with all these things building safety related, there is never a very clear statement of exactly what's going on. So the way I describe this is around joining the dots. So I do a number of things. So the first one is I turn to what have the government actually put out. And the most comprehensive utterance from the government was in July last year, where they talked about they put an update out about the Remediation Acceleration Plan, the RAP. When this was initially announced, it was announced as the Comprehensive Remediation Acceleration Plan, and they dropped that very quickly after its first outing as an acronym. So it's now the RAP, and this hinted at a lot of what was planned to be in the remediation bill back in July 2025. Building on top of that, I was invited to a meeting with the Building Safety Minister in early June, where I hope to get a really clear briefing on what was going on and share that with you today. It was good. It was nice to be invited. It was always nice to have a trip to London. Unfortunately, the way I would describe the meeting was it was like trying to talk to a press release. Every question was answered with, well, I kind of knew exactly what the answer to every single question was going to be because it's what's been in the press releases before. So it did confirm a few things that sort of slipped out, which I'll come on to, but really it wasn't the game changer other than we're on with this. But what I did find out on the 2nd of June was that at that point, this bill had not gone to the business managers of the House of Commons. So the business managers are the ones that would then work on finding the time to actually schedule this into its various stages of debate and committees and all that sort of stuff to become law. So as at early June, the department had not put this to the business managers. So whether they have now or not, I don't know, but they hadn't in early June, as far as I was told. So there are still opportunities for this, I think, to fall by the wayside until it gets into that calendar. And the draft bill is published. We're still effectively guessing. We took in press reporting, of which there hasn't been very much, to be honest. It's been a bit of a damp squib from that respect, in terms of holding government to account from a press perspective. And then the other important thing is the industry chatter. I spent a lot of time talking to people in the industry, and we all talk to each other in various groups, and we piece things together to try and build a picture that we can share about what we think might happen. But as I said, the draft bill is not yet published, so it's very difficult to. Ben's mentioned a couple of times some quite well reported timelines, which we'll explain. But again, until that bill is issued as a draft, we don't know whether those dates will have moved or been deleted completely. One of the key points with this, even at quite a late stage, is if we all remember the Building Safety Act, there was a legal duty holder role of the building safety manager that was in there for a long time, and then that whole role got deleted from the legislation that ended up becoming law, becoming an act. So even if we're talking about statutory completion or remediation dates now, doesn't mean to say that they'll end up in the bill when it becomes an act of parliament. So we will see. What I would say is if you just keep an eye on our socials, whether that's LinkedIn, Twitter, or whatever, mainly LinkedIn, as soon as I find any more, I'll post about it. So just make sure if you're following Building Safety Register, Fortis and Charter, Ben, myself, one of us is likely to be talking about this as we learn more. But sorry for not being definitive. What we do know from the objectives that were published by the government, and again, these haven't changed yet, is the three key objectives with the Remediation Bill. Number one is to fix buildings faster, accelerate the remediation. Number two is to identify the buildings that need to be remediated. So again, still nobody really knows what the scope of this is in terms of volume of buildings and their heights, and then support residents through this process. Which again, the rhetoric is always residents are at the heart of everything we do, and etc. It's all resident focused. The reality is that they're kind of a bit of a bystander, really. I think generally, in the way that this is all played out, and that's wrong. And the other key point is that now, whereas the government always used to talk about HRBs, post-Grenfell, it was all about high rises, their language is now moving to one of 11 metre plus, that mid and high rise, still not talking about low rise, but they're now talking about mid and high rise, not really distinguishing them from a remediation perspective. And as Baroness Pinnock has called this, large residential buildings, LRBs, although that isn't legal terminology yet. So they're the high level objectives. If I just break down a bit more detail about each of the three. So fixing faster, so objective one. There's rumour of some work around social landlord funding. I think I'll gloss over this. It's to do with making it a bit easier, I think, for social landlords to actually get remediations funded. I don't know the detail of it. PAS 9980, that's the legal standard. The talk is around agreeing on a standard. It doesn't actually name PAS 9980, but that's my understanding, is that PAS 9980 would become law effectively. And we could probably do an entire 3 or 4 lunch and learns on PAS 9980. That's not the plan today. It has significant critics, as well as a number of supporters. So we'll probably, I think at that point, gloss past that, maybe come back to it in the Q&A. Key thing, a legal duty to remediate. So this is the date that Ben was talking about. So our understanding at the moment is that there would be 2 dates. One would be a date for 18 metre plus remediation, which is the end of December 2029.
Yep.
So that's to have all of them remediated. And then 11 to 18 metres, the end of December 2031. We will no doubt debate whether this is realistic or not, but they're the dates as we understand it. But again, that could change. Effectively, if you are responsible for a building and you have missed or failed in your duty to remediate, our understanding is there are more fines and criminal penalties on the way for you as the responsible person or the accountable person. Again, detail hasn't been shared. They're also bringing in a national remediation system. This is another database that my understanding is that this would be administered by Homes England, and it would be the definitive database of 11 metre plus buildings and their external wall makeups and their defects and their remediation requirements, etc. I asked a few questions, as you probably imagine as a data person, to the Minister about how this would operate, how it would interact with other databases that are similar, for example, the Public Register of HRBs. And I wasn't necessarily overwhelmed with the quality of the response, let's just put it like that. They talk about the single source of data. This is probably the 5th or 6th single source of data that I've had described to me that were all operated by different reasons. I don't think that is a single source of data. And again, we've talked about this before, but we will see the detail and see what level of joined up thinking emerges. And then we have another new acronym, the LRAP, the Local Remediation Acceleration Plans. My understanding of this is enhanced funding and powers for metro mayors, of which I think there are about 8 or 12 or so, including Manchester, where Mayor Burnham was the mayor. And they will be given some form of additional powers to basically lead on remediation within their metro mayor areas. Again, as a Manchester resident, Ben, what are your views on Mayor Burnham as he was in terms of his involvement with building safety? Was he prominent in that?
No, not really. And Andy Burnham was prominent in the development of the built environment, still is prominent in the development of the built environment in Manchester and Greater Manchester. He had a very strong interest in new build residential projects, and we've seen the skyline of Manchester change significantly over the last 10 or so years. But there's nothing particular that draws attention to his presence regarding remediation. I think that we do a lot of work in Manchester, as we do in other towns and cities across the UK, and they come to us through the same level of procurement and sort of project management, if you will. There's no sort of deviation from that process, and there was certainly nothing particularly aligned to Manchester. So yeah, the answer is no, unfortunately.
The only glimmer of light I have really in terms of thinking where his head might be is that I do remember in the sort of immediate years post Grenfell that Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service were kind of at the forefront of response, if you like, in terms of early remediation, identification of problems, etc. So I don't know how much of that drive came from him as the mayor or how much just was initiated from within the fire service, but yeah, that's the only.
Yeah, well, I couldn't confirm or otherwise, but I do know you're absolutely right, that was the case, and I've had the pleasure of speaking with and dealing with a lot of those individuals within the Greater Manchester Fire Rescue Service, who actually, some of which have left now and become independent fire engineers, so on and so forth, and they did a lot of good work. What I'd like to see is a continuation of that through to the remediation phase, and a sort of a maintained narrative, if you will.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so that's the first objective, key points from the first objective. And again, if anyone's got any questions on these, we'll circle back to them. So please stick something in the comments or put your hand up at the end, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. So identifying the buildings. Well, there is the next new legal duty, which is the legal duty to assess. I can't find this written down. My recollection is that this would be within 12 months of royal assent of the Act. So there would be a commencement date where there is then a 12-month clock that says that every single building within the scope of the Remediation Bill, so 11 metres plus, would need to have effectively a safety assessment in place and be, I guess, registered with the government if issues are found. There is also, I'm a bit confused about this, because there is also already from May 2022, after the Fire Safety Act commenced, a legal duty on responsible persons to include the external wall within their fire risk assessment, or pay regard to that. So you could construct an argument that says all of those buildings now that exist should have already risk assessed the external wall and should be acting on those findings if those findings were negative or were concerning. So quite how this interacts with the fire safety order, I don't know. I guess the detail will come out. And again, if there's anybody in the audience that has particular expertise in this area, then it would be great to hear in the comments, but I'm a little bit confused by this. But effectively, the number of buildings with problems should be definitive by that backstop date. 12 months after royal assent, we should know the exact number of buildings that need to be remediated, 11 meters plus, and what's wrong with them. To build to this, again, Homes England have apparently sifted through 212,000 ordnance survey records and assessed them. And from that, they've deduced the buildings where they believe there might be some building safety issues. Again, I'm completely flummoxed by how they've done this, what tools they've used, who they've used, etc. But my understanding is this is where the number of buildings that potentially have got problems that haven't yet been identified has come from that range of 1.5 to 3,000 buildings. And further to that, they are then deploying local resources through, I think, the fire service and local authorities to go and have a closer look at those buildings and track down the responsible persons and turn them from being an unknown into a known, if you like, and getting them on the list of buildings that are being monitored. That is, I think, how this process is working. Again, it seems to be a little opaque. I don't know, have you heard any more about this, Ben, or is this?
No, I think you've essentially covered it. I'm as interested to understand how this process works. One of my primary concerns would be how up to date the ordnance survey records are. I know in some instances when we deal with location plans, etc., they seem to be not quite where you'd want them to be. So there's bound to be, unfortunately, some level of discrepancy there, I would suggest. But I'm very interested to see what the outputs look like. No one would like a list of buildings that need attention more than I would, for obvious reasons. But it's important that list is accurate as well.
Yeah, we will find out. Hopefully that will become clear. As I say, there's minimal detail available on this. It seems to be after we got through the fix faster bit, the government planning seems to have gone a little bit sort of less granular as we go on. So hopefully they're busily working up more and more detail about this. And then supporting residents, and again, this falls, I think, into the category of being particularly underwhelming. The key part of the announcement is around them funding, or the government putting a funding scheme in place for buildings under 11 meters on an exceptional basis. There's still, the rhetoric is there is not a systemic issue with low-rise buildings from a safety perspective. However much data is collected, campaigners campaign on this, the government line is there's no systemic problem. So therefore, on an exceptional basis, they will fund remediation sub 11 meters. This has been around in stealth mode for years already anyway, they called it a pilot funding scheme, but effectively I think they're just going to formalize that as a low, as an actual known funding route. And it would be interesting, I would expect that to then fall into the monthly data release, so we can actually sort of see how many buildings are being tracked, what that's adding to the total. Increasing rights of shared ownership, tenants for subletting during this gets really complicated, but my understanding is if a shared ownership building has been remediated, during the remediation there was an exemption where if you needed to move out, you could sublet your shared ownership flat privately. And I think that right unwinds as soon as remediation finishes. I think they're going to extend that. So if you were then never moving back in and you're selling, while that sale completes, you'll be able to carry on subletting, I think. Don't know how many people that applies to. And then they also want to increase regulators' powers to remediate, so to force remediation in buildings that have been decanted due to safety issues. Again, most of you may have seen, or if not, have a look at our website. We actually keep a tracker of post-Grenfell decants, which we keep up to date, but still it's a relatively small number of buildings where the regulator can step in and I think say, oh, you need to hurry up and get people back into their homes now you've curved them out, I think. As I say, the funding for sub 11 meters isn't new, or certainly not new to me. Interesting to know from the comments if it's new to anybody here that's available. So they're the three key objectives. I think it's important that we look at what the National Audit Office say, and they're the ones that police up the government's activity in this area. They last spoke about this in 2024, late 2024, and at that time they were pushing the government to publish a target date for getting cladding remediation finished. I think the Remediation Bill backstop dates is effectively doing that, enshrining those dates in law. But the issue is, during 2024, when the National Audit Office looked at the MHCLG numbers, they said that MHCLG was saying the end of 2035 for completing this. So 2035 does not tally to 2031 or 2029. So I think we need to understand more, and I'm hoping through the passage of this bill, somebody will ask them to explain how 2035 has become 2031 and 2029. I don't know your thoughts on that, Ben. How does this compute with you?
I think I've mentioned the dates a couple of times already, and there's a reason for that. You know, if you use 2020, 31st of December 29 for remediation on buildings over 18 meters, based on experience, not opinion, those processes would have need to have started. And what I mean by that is application of funding, design intent, you know, based on the back of a FRIEW or something similar, and otherwise I think it's largely unattainable unless there's a huge shift in the system and the way that funding is drawn down and the way that contractors are appointed and clerk of works are instructed, etc., so on and so forth. I think that it's tight. I think 35 is probably a more realistic date. Don't get me wrong, I'd love to see all these buildings remediated quicker, but we have to do it properly and we have to maintain the standard that actually solves the problem. My primary concern sits around, do we do this quicker or do we do it properly? And it's very hard to do both. So that's sort of where I'm at the moment.
So on the quick versus properly, it was interesting when we spoke a few days ago, we were chatting, quite a bit of the work you do or your team do is insurance warranty surveying as well. So, yeah. And I asked you the question around, is this work warranted or is it insurable, the remediation work that's already been completed? And I was pretty astounded by how many sites you've been to actually sign off on insurance-backed warranties for remediation. Do you want to run through with everybody how many your team has been to?
Well, it's an easy answer because next to none from a warranty perspective. Look, we do many projects from a clerk of works quality audit perspective in terms of ensuring that the works administered are as per the design and other nuances that arrive within a project, which I think we'll come to in a moment. In terms of the insurance backed element, I know there are products available. I know that the underwriters are working hard to put warranty insurance policies put warranty based insurance policies into the industry for recladding and remediation works, but we seldom, if ever, have been called to do inspections just for the purpose of a warranty being installed on a facade remediation, which I find astounding. I think, you know, if as a building owner, as a accountable person, whatever context you have control over that building, you would want some assurances that that the work that's being done is going to be is correct and is going to stand the test of time, certainly for a period stated within that policy, but nowhere near enough. I'm trying to think of examples that I could give where I don't think we've ever done it independently. I think it's always been part of a system, but we are talking small percentages of the work that we cover.
That is concerning, but it's just one to ponder. So it brings me on to, so we've talked about the timelines, and it's very easy, I think, to say, oh, this will take years. And really what I wanted to try and get across was, why do these projects take so long? When we're, I think for many people, they just think we'll just, take some cladding off, put some cladding on, move on. Why are we talking about 7, 8, 9, 10 years of work from now onwards? So I was hoping you might be able to flick. So if I just flick these on, could you just quickly talk us through, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but some of the reasons why these projects take such a huge amount of time?
Yeah, I haven't got my glasses on, but the first one is finance, right? So we don't get involved in the application for finance. However, what I will do is tell you that 9 out of the 10 projects we offer quotation for in terms of the Clerk of Works application service has to be re-quoted, because they tend to only come into fruition 2 or 3 years after our original quote. So the building's obviously been identified. There's a project being put together. We're going to remediate this building. We put a price in, and then the project management companies come back to us and sort of say, look, can you still do this? Are you still on board with this? But 2-3 years have passed. That's not unusual. So if you work on that basis, that whilst that's not accurate, and someone in this meeting will probably be able to give you more accurate in the comments, it's a significant amount of time from conception to the start of work. Second one is planning. I think that's part of it. I think the buildings are identified as needed to be remediated, but then the more you look at a building via an intrusive survey, an FRAEW, it offers new challenges. But then you've also got the local authority aspect. Can we swap these materials for something that looks the same? If not, what will it look like? How does that impact on the actual planning applications, etc.? Construction, I'll come back to, because that's. I mean, we could go all day on that, frankly. What's the
Gateway 2? Gateway 2.
Yeah, well, Gateway 2, I mean, there won't be many people in here that are involved in construction that don't understand the frustrations of Gateway 2. It is getting better, but it's been, the prescribed timeframes have been excessive, or rather the timeframes have been excessive of the prescribed, certainly in recent history. And they too have an aspect, because a lot of these issues are out obviously before anything gets done, so everyone's sort of sat in limbo waiting to get cracking. The key one, Matt, sorry.
Access.
Well, for various reasons, these are, it sounds very negative, this, but these are all things that slow us down. I think I'll summarize it like that, because if you can't get to the building, you struggle to work on it. But then you've got the resident engagement element of making sure that you can carry out those works, you can get the access you need without causing harm to people that are living in the building if they're going to stay there, etc., so on and so forth. So all of these things they're all very important, obviously, and they all carry their own set of potential delays, and unfortunately, the way things are at the moment, those potential delays tend to develop into actual delays. And the last one, forgive me again,
unexpected works, which I think we're going to come on to in a
so I want to pair construction and unexpected works together, because with the best intent in the world, you create a construction phase plan, you program of works, you get everyone together, you workshop all these ideas, we understand what we're going to do, and I'll leave it at that for now, because I know what's coming next. But yeah, it's I don't mean to sound negative, but the reality is that we're talking about this in the context of timeframes, and these timeframes don't necessarily account for some of the issues that are faced within all of those areas.
I think when I was putting this together, I suddenly thought after as well, whether so many other issues that can come along, that can effectively, it's just kind of, it's the I would sort of describe it as the law of sod. You know, it just will happen. Something will happen, and that sort of brings me on to the next one, which is around trying to think of a name for it, but sort of I came up with certain uncertainty. So we can be certain that we're uncertain.
Yeah.
Certainty evolves over time, but it takes time. So there will be bad weather along the way. There will be issues that we encounter that we didn't expect. We don't necessarily know what they are, but we know it when we spot them.
Yeah.
And I think this is the key point I wanted to do. You quite often send me gruesome photos of construction sites, and that's the sort of thing we send each other. And I put a compilation together of one site here, which I think hopefully illustrates the nature of the beast when you take that shiny facade off a building. Could you maybe, if I go through slide by slide, if you could just maybe talk us through the amount you're willing to or able to disclose, that would be great.
Yeah, obviously I won't identify the site for obvious reasons, and I'm just trying to remind myself which one it is. Okay, yes. So this is a residential block. It's in scope. I won't say where it is. And it had what would consider an inappropriate facade on it. So the facade was coming off. That was determined through the standard intrusive surveys, etc. And we get to site. So thankfully on this one, the situation was there was a delay in the delivery of the new cladding. So it was decided that the whole building would be stripped. So every elevation will be stripped off, and these are some of the examples that we found. One, you've got huge amounts of timber forming, bulkheads and parapets that are in there that weren't anticipated. They weren't necessarily all picked up as part of the initial investigation. But then what I'm trying to identify here is I think there's 75 millimeters of packers there between a timber substrate and what is intended or was intended on this particular project to be a retained system. So the idea was that the new cladding panels would be screwed onto the existing rails and helping hand details, etc. So 75 mil of packers, and it was when we took them out, they were a 90 mil fixing. So not only was the fixing inadequate, but it was into a substrate which needs to come out and through plastic packers, and the result would have been there in the failure of this not being resolved, that should the temperature increase sufficiently or should this catch light, the entire soffit would fall onto the balcony of the people below, which is obviously unacceptable.
Yeah, that's that. And I'm assuming that this wasn't known prior to stripping this building, right? So this is one of the delays that you've experienced. I'll
talk about how much time this has cost at the end, or did cost in the end, once we found them. So this is again following the removal of the cladding. These are the lightweight steel gauge partitions that form the barriers between residential balconies, and there's the leading factor into this was the gully positions were set too high. So well, the gully positions were fine actually, but the outfall was higher than the top of the gully. So the balconies would permanently retain about 50 millimeters of water. Only when it was stripped back did we realise that the galvanisation of the steel elements was all but destroyed. And that actually, whilst that's just one example, that went throughout the entire building, but again, not picked up. Is that another example of the same, Aisha?
No, this is the corner detail of the balcony.
Oh yeah, right. So going back a step, so the gullies were put in retrospectively when the initial, what we think, when the original gullies were put in, they were put in the wrong position, and so retrospectively somebody's been back and put new ones in. What they've done is cut through the top layer of steel reinforcement mesh in the structural concrete balcony, and as you can see there, the last perhaps 300 millimeters, maybe a little bit more, of that balcony for the entire depth of the gully is effectively hovering, but also carrying the structural glazing element which forms the fall arrest on the balcony. So we spent a lot of time with the structural engineers on this point, and it was decided that significant remediation needed to be done on this.
Okay, so just as a reminder, still with all the stuff we're looking at now, none of this was factored into the original project scope or project program.
None of this was on program. None of this was identified before the cladding came off.
Yeah.
The photos, this one's similar to the first one, actually. You get the idea. You've got, excuse me, I'm just going to zoom in. You've got a significant amount of packers there onto a timber substrate holding the cement board, which forms a soffit of the balconies below. Again, the fixings were found to be too short when they came out. None of this could have been seen at the beginning because it was buried in cladding.
Okay.
And you've just done another one and I've missed it. And then, yeah, so when the original CP board was put on, when the building was originally put together, obviously mist drills or whatever, it just so happens that this area wasn't picked up as part of the intrusive survey. No one really knew that drainage pipe was there, which is an issue on its own because it leaked and caused significant damage down the side of the building. But more concerningly, large apertures around existing services. We saw not just this one, but we saw around the extraction ducts. Not all of them, and ironically, the ones that were inspected during the intrusive survey weren't too bad. But typically, around extraction ducts, you'd have gaps of 30 to 50 millimeters, which would obviously just allow a breach, which is not suitable and needed to be remediated.
So a quick question for you, and we'll go on to Q&A. So if there wasn't somebody like you as clerk of works coming and supervising this or inspecting this, and you've got a contractor in that's on a fixed price, etc., do we run the risk of compounding these sorts of problems even in a building that is on the list as being remediated? Could it? Yeah, we do, and I think, you know, if this building had been reclad without these issues being remediated, then there would have been a very short timeline before these issues manifested anyway. And also the life safety element of the gaps in the CP board, of the potential for the glazing to fall out, of the helping hands failing and the bracketry failing, to which the new cladding was fixed because of all the issues we just discussed. And to say they wouldn't have been remediated, I don't know, because you'd like to think that the contractor would pick them up. However, the conversations that we tend to have around these issues is, well, how long is it going to take to get the new calculations? How far do we go back on this? What is the solution? We now need to get a design solution. We need to get a variation. The contracts need to be changed. The program needs to be increased. And they're all valid things for a contractor. So one may form an argument that if the contractor's perception was, actually, I don't think that's too bad, not through negligence, but perhaps through ignorance potentially, and then some of these issues wouldn't be resolved. I'm biased. Clerk of Works is a skill set that I'm passionate about. It's something that I believe in. It's something that we need more of. However, fundamentally, there are several issues in there, and I don't want to say too much in case anyone does recognise the job, that wouldn't have got resolved if we hadn't have pushed very hard to make sure that they had. And this is one example of many risks. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So, in conclusion, right? So there is a long road ahead. How long that road is, nobody knows. The TPI again that I mentioned earlier reported a couple of days ago, saying that they still believe it could take around 10 years before developer pledges. So these are the buildings where they've been built by identified developers like the Barratts and the Persimmons, etc., and the Taylor Wimpey's that have signed up to the developer pledge. The TPI is saying, we think this is 10 years worth of work ahead of us. Again, that doesn't correlate to the 2029, 2031 dates. Their sample was 511 blocks, of which, as you can see there, 76% of them have not been started yet. I don't know where they got their sample from or geographic distribution, but that was what was in the press reporting. So if we've got 2029 by law, is it 2036 in reality? Who knows? We will find out. We'll maybe come back in 10 years and do a review. But with that, I will hand over to questions and see where we go from there. We've got a few minutes left. So do we have any questions, Richard?
There's none coming on the chat channel at the moment, but I had some submitted earlier. So I've got a question for Ben. What is the average project delay due to unforeseen issues in your experience?
Average is difficult to establish because it really is subjective to the issues that you find. But to tally back to something that we've just learnt about, if you look at the examples in the previous two slides ago rather, excuse me, the delays on there equated to about 4 months. That was 4 months of downtime, that was 4 months of prelims, that was 4 months of extra design work, of sort of interface details being discussed. Can we do this? If we do this, how does it affect that? You know, so it can take a long time. The most extreme, I appreciate I'm giving you a non-answer here to the person who asked the question, but the most extreme delay based on matters arising, if you want to call it that, is ongoing, and we're 2 years since we left site. So the remediation started nearly 3 years ago. We did a year's worth of work, came across some significant issues in a particular area of the project, and we've not been back since because it's under significant design review. And you can imagine that's an occupied building as well, so you can imagine the amount of like waking watch, etc., so on and so forth, and cost impact there. So I'm afraid I can't give you an average, but I will say I've never done a project, a facade remediation in particular project, that hasn't suffered some sort of delay.
Thank you for that. The next question, you did talk earlier about Andy Burnham and how engaged he has been with this program, and or whether or not he has been engaged, sort of aligned with that, and nothing's set in stone yet, and we don't know what the outcome will be. But how is a change of Prime Minister going to affect this? Do we think that a new Prime Minister might actually take more on board, or do more, or do you think it'll just be more of the same?
I'll say my bit, and Matt's probably got more on this because he's better educated on it. But I think Matt actually answered the question earlier, if I'm honest. If a general election is called, there is going to be a question mark as to whether this bill will pass into the new realms of government. If not, then there's a limited amount of time to do it, frankly. You know, I think if you look at it like that, so the question mark, well, Matt, perhaps you want to go a bit further on that, because you tend to be better at these things in terms of political perspective.
Well, trying to be sort of simplistic about it, I don't think it's going to help any kind of government business. I mean, the impression I got back in early June was very much one of, we're all kind of maybe sitting on our hands a bit to wait and see what happens from a ministerial perspective. It must be unsettling. And then I think the other point is that if Burnham does become the Prime Minister, which most people think he will, and then if he goes to the country for a general election sooner rather than later, there's no guarantee that he's going to be returned as the Prime Minister, in which case all gloves are off, because who knows what a Prime Minister from a different party might do. They probably won't just pick up all of the legislation from the previous incumbents. They'll come with new priorities. So I don't think any of this is helpful. This kind of hokey-cokey of building safety ministers and secretaries of state of housing and prime ministers, etc. I don't think, if we look back since Grenfell, I don't think any of this has been helpful to getting the problem solved.
No, a call for stability would be nice, and I think my hope is that whoever takes the reins, decides to lead this country through whatever measures, they understand the importance of this, and they maintain the narrative that we need to fix this, but do take a reasonable and pragmatic approach.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to finish, as I'm conscious it's 1 o'clock. Just a quick bit of business. We won't be back in August. We're taking an August summer break, so we'll be back on the 3rd of September. So we will be sending out booking links to everybody. We will be sending out a link later on today or tomorrow to watch this back and get your feedback. All that remains for me to say is thank all of the team, and thank Ben for coming along. Thank all of the audience for coming along, and whoever's here live and people that watch it on YouTube afterwards. And just to say, our channels are open. Give me a call, hit me up on LinkedIn, contact the team if you've got any questions or anything that you don't think we addressed today. And we look forward to seeing you on the 3rd of September. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.